This is the story of Ruffin, Kendrick, and Edwards. Following the reunion tour, the Temptations continued with Motown releasing the Surface Thrills album in February of 1983 and Back to Basics later that year. Dennis Edwards would leave the group before the release of Back to Basics due to his drug habit and problems with founding members, Otis Williams and Melvin Franklin. When asked about his second departure from the Temps, Dennis said, "I was in a bad way, missing meetings, smoking weed, doing a little coke. By this time, I was questioning some of the group's moves. Otis and Melvin were making all of the decisions and no one else mattered. When we did the Motown 25 show, Ali Woodson was in the audience and I knew that he was going to be my replacement. A friend of mine told me they had been rehearsing him for a while. After Motown 25, I did a couple of more shows and then I left the act in Las Vegas. They called in Ali to do the show." After leaving the group, Dennis recorded and released a solo album entitled Don't Look Any Further. The title track became a massive hit and peaked at number 2 on the U.S. Billboard Black Singles charts. His follow-up album, Coolin' Out, didn't do so well, and the reason for that, according to Dennis, is because Motown didn't promote it. "I went back to the brass at Motown, still looking for my $1 million deal, but I didn't get any love from the company. Whenever you ask for money in our business, you're the bad guy. The label didn't market Coolin' Out because they were mad at me, and I also think they didn't want me to be more successful than the Temptations." After his brief reunion with the Temptations, Eddie Kendricks resumed his solo career and released the album I've Got My Eyes on You in 1983 and the single Surprise Attack in 1984. As for David, he was sentenced to 6 months in prison for tax evasion in late 1982. Once he was released in 1983, he moved on to a farm and remained there and out of the spotlight until 1985. One day, while sitting at home, Eddie received a call from Daryl Hall and John Oates, who told him they wanted him and David to perform with them at the Apollo Theater. Eddie was more than happy to do it, but David wasn't so sure, but he eventually said yes, and the show ended up being a huge success, and it was also recorded and released as a live album. A live medley of The Way You Do the Things You Do and My Girl were released as a single and earned David his first and only Grammy nomination. The show at the Apollo went so well that the two duos decided to continue performing together. To say Hall and Oates were elated to be working with the two former Temps would be an understatement. They had been fans of the Temptations since their early years, and had even formed a group called the Temptones. So when they got the chance to work with their heroes, they jumped at it. Initially, Hall and Oates wanted Otis and Melvin at the Apollo also, but they weren't interested. When speaking about Otis and Melvin not joining them, David said, "It worked out better this way." During the same interview, Eddie said, "The reunion could have blossomed to something bigger and lasting. It should have become an ongoing thing. There were problems, lots of problems. I don't want to go into all of them. A big problem was simply business. There's a difference in our business tactics and our business ideas." When he was asked if he would ever consider reuniting with Otis and Melvin, he said, "I'd probably do it again. David would probably do it again too. But circumstances would have to be right. Some things get under your skin and you never get rid of them. That's the way it is with being in the Temptations. It gets under your skin and never goes away." Eddie also added that he no longer kept in contact with the group, but he and David were close and everything was looking up for them. They released an album entitled Ruffin and Kendrick in 1987 on the RCA label. But the album had very little success due to poor promotion, and this may have been because by the time the album came out, the people at RCA had grown tired of working with David and Eddie. It's said that David didn't like anything on the album, so he brought in songs that he had written, produced, and recorded, but they were all rejected. Having no creative input made David even more frustrated, and shortly after the release of the album, he and Daryl Hall allegedly had a falling out over his heavy drug use. This would lead to the two duos parting ways. In 1987, Dennis rejoined the Temps, replacing his replacement, Ali Woodson. However, Dennis would end up leaving the group for the final time in 1988 because he felt he wasn't being paid enough. "When I came back for this, The third time, believe it or not, I was on salary. I am the lead singer, yet while they split up the money, I'm on salary. Then we're in Las Vegas and I wanted an advance to buy my mom a vase, and they said we can't talk about it. So I left the group and went home to St. Louis. The next year, the Temptations were set to be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and Dennis thought only the Classic Five were going in, but he received a letter in the mail saying that they were going to induct 6 members. So for the first time since the reunion tour, David, Eddie, Dennis, Melvin, and Oates were going to be on stage together. On the evening of the induction, David, Eddie, and Dennis met in the lobby and went downstairs only to find Oates' group sitting in the seats that had been reserved for them. According to Dennis, the director came in and made Ron Tyson, Allie Woodson, and Richard Street get up and move to the back. Oates and Melvin followed, refusing to sit with Dennis, David, and Eddie. They put their differences aside long enough to pay tribute to the late great Paul Williams and accept their awards, but there would be no after party. Following the ceremony, David, Eddie, and Dennis went for a walk, and a promoter approached them and said, "Why don't you guys work together?" Dennis responded, "I hadn't thought about it, but it would be great." David and Eddie agreed, and they went to Detroit and spent about 2 months rehearsing and putting their act together, and then hit the road. The trio went on to successfully tour the States and Europe, billing themselves as the former lead singers of the Temptations. They were booked consistently and were usually picked first over Oates' Temptations. They also received multiple recording offers, but one of the stipulations was to keep David clean. And in 1991, he got clean and remained clean until the end of a European tour in May of that year. According to Dennis, Eddie and David had all made $55,000 each, receiving $5,000 in cash and the rest in a bank draft. Dennis and Eddie were fine with this, but David wanted all of his money in cash. So Dennis and Eddie headed back home and David stayed behind to collect the money. Once he got the money, he flew to Philadelphia. According to police reports, David was driven to a West Philadelphia crack house between 10 and 11 p.m. on May 31st. It's said that while there he collapsed and was then taken by limousine to the hospital of the University of Pennsylvania. Doctors worked to save his life, but they were unsuccessful. On June 1st, 1991, David Ruffin sadly passed away at the age of 50. It was reported that a money belt containing $40,000 was missing from David's body, and the traveler's checks that belonged to Dennis and Eddie had also mysteriously disappeared from his briefcase. His death was ruled an accidental overdose, but many believe he was a victim of foul play. David's homegoing service was held on June 10, 1991, at New Bethel Baptist Church in Detroit. Family, friends, and fans all gathered to pay their respects to the greatest soul singer of all time. Among those in attendance were the Temptations. Both past and present members stood together and sang David's most popular song, "My Girl." Shortly after this very emotional tribute, Eddie Kendrick was arrested and taken out of the church. He was arrested for non-payment of $26,000 in child support. He was soon bailed out by the founder of Motown, Berry Gordy. The loss of his best friend and being arrested at his funeral only added to Eddie's problems. He had been struggling with his voice for years, and during the tour he started to become short-winded on stage. After a visit to the doctor, he found out there was a spot on his lung, but he continued performing, and according to one of the backup singers, Eddie got sicker as the tour went on. It was also said that his condition got worse after the passing of David, and in October he had one of his lungs removed. But just weeks after the operation, Eddie and Dennis started touring again. According to Dennis, Eddie had gotten so weak during one of their shows that he had to be carried off the stage. It was around this time that Eddie requested that former Temptations member Damon Harris join them. In June of 1992, Eddie and Dennis performed at the Apollo Theater in what would be Eddie's last public performance. On October 5, 1992, Eddie Kendrick passed away from lung cancer at the age of 52. In 1993, Dennis Edwards released his third solo album, Talk to Me, on the Three Gems label. The album didn't do that well, but he continued performing as a solo artist. The next year, the Temptations received a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, and Dennis was sure he'd be a part of it, as he had been a huge part of the group's success. But much to his surprise, he wasn't included nor invited. I found out through a friend that the Temptations won an award. Everywhere I'd go, I'd hear, "Hey man, I didn't see you on TV." Regardless of what they don't like about me, I'm not worried about it. I'm going to get my star. The Temptations manager, Shelley Berger, who submitted the names of the Temptations who were to receive plaques, had this to say regarding the matter. "There was no reason for us to invite Edwards, because he has nothing to do with the Temptations. The decision was to include the Temptations, not everybody who was a part of that group. He didn't come into the category of original Temptations or present Temptations. So why would we have him involved?" Dennis said, quote, "When I heard this, I was incensed. I was really insulted." Dennis was no longer a member of Oates's Temptations, but in 1995 he formed his own group and toured under the name Dennis Edwards and the New Temptations, which prompted a legal battle between him and Oates. In 1997, a federal judge ruled that Dennis and his group could continue performing under their current name. However, Oates appealed the ruling, and Dennis was legally barred from using the name. So the group's name was then changed to the Temptations Review featuring Dennis Edwards. Oates must have spent $1 million trying to shut me down, and I spent $800,000 trying to stay working. Dennis refused to let a name change stop him. He said, quote, "The last thing Eddie told me before he died was to keep the group together." So in honor of EK, he kept on trucking. As mentioned earlier, Dennis said that right before leaving the Temptations in 1983, he began to question some of the group's moves. He stated that Oates and Melvin were making all of the decisions and no one else mattered. This ties into what Richard Street said. "I began to believe my observations about Oates. He was power hungry. He was happy that Paul and Eddie left because when they were a part of the group, everything was different. If they didn't want to do anything they did not want to, they just did not do it. If they did not want to perform at a concert, they would not show up. While they were members of the group, Oates was never able to make decisions without the approval of the members. After their departure, however, all decisions were made solely by Oates." In an interview with Kiss Radio, Dennis revealed that he and some of the other group members found out that Oates and Berry Gordy were having secret meetings, and he was sure that Oates was receiving more money. He also said that this caused them to lose trust. Despite their issues, they came together in 2013 when the Temptations received the Grammys Lifetime Achievement Award. While on stage that night, Dennis said, "Oates, thanks to you, I became a real temptation." He continued performing with his Temptations Review until he fell ill in 2017, and on February 1st, 2018, Dennis Edwards passed away due to complications of meningitis. Though their time together was short, there's no denying that David, Eddie, and Dennis were indeed the voices. If you enjoyed this video, please like, comment, share, and subscribe, and join us next time.